Alright, so this is the second video on autonomy. A kind of an interesting chapter. A chapter that is very much related to some of the central themes of the course. Certainly we've been talking about freedom, we've been talking about choice, and that was very, very prominent in Friedman, but it's also been an important part and aspect of our discussions in other areas. So this component of autonomy, this chapter, or this video in particular, is going to talk about autonomy in relationship to consumers, which was the main subject of the first autonomy video. But it's going to do so by way of analyzing advertising, and then I'm also going to talk about autonomy in relationship to employees. So we haven't talked much about employee autonomy, but we will go over that here. So with regard to advertisements, it's important in marketing in general. It's important to talk about that because the reality is that advertising surrounds us constantly. It is an all-pervasive type of force in our lives. There's advertisements every time we click on the internet, every time we watch TV, every road that we drive in, every movie that we watch. So advertising is constant. Companies are continuously trying to get you to buy their products, and in more and more creative ways. And sports as well would just be one more example. Now, the fundamental question with regard to advertising in relationship to this chapter is whether you think that advertising promotes or undermines autonomy. Now again, autonomy is the ability to make your own decisions, the ability to kind of manage your own life, the ability to live your life the way that you would wish. So the question then becomes, does advertising allow you to live the way you wish? Does it allow you to promote your own decision making? Or does it undermine that? Okay, so if you critique it from the perspective of defending autonomy, you might say that it creates unnecessary demand and is based upon manipulation. That essentially advertising is not there to help you, support you in your own decision making, but it's there to manipulate you to purchase or make the decision that the advertiser wishes you to make. So for example, in the book they talk about this idea of, well, kids cereal. It can be very sugary, it can be very unhealthy, or at least certain brands, and the branding of that cereal is oftentimes done in such a way that it attracts kids' interests. And so the very unhealthy cereals can be very, very good at attracting that interest. They can place it in the supermarket in such a way that it's the first thing that a kid will see when you walk down the aisle. And then the kid can really start to demand it, can really start to want it, and create an incredible fuss and incredible pain for the parent. Please mommy, please mommy, please mommy, that kind of stuff. And that also occurs on the television shows that kids watch. They'll encourage kids to ask, for example, their parents to get them something. And so, in a certain sense, they're using the child to manipulate the parent. At least that's what one could argue. And you can ask yourself, is that fair? Is that right? To use the child who is very gullible, the child who is not able to critically analyze whether this product is good for them, or worthwhile, or affordable. Is it okay for advertisers knowingly to go in there trying to attract the parent through the kid, to get the kid, in other words, to become the vehicle to make the parent's purchase? There's also a kind of manipulation where you might say, look, the advertisers have the ability to create a perceived need for products that are ultimately luxuries, and ultimately maybe are very expensive. Do you really need that flat screen TV? The crystal clear picture? Is that necessary? Certainly many times advertisers will try to convince you that it is, but is it? Do you really need to take that vacation to, Disney World or something like that? Certainly advertisers will try to get you to believe that this is necessary, that this is essential, that your life will not be complete or fulfilled without making this decision or going on this trip. And then finally, and one I always find interesting is that oftentimes, immediately after a championship game, an advertisement will come on for the team that won their gear. Essentially saying, buy this gear, you're champions, congratulations. Is that manipulating emotions? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. Now, if you were to defend advertising on the grounds of autonomy, you might say that, look, it's not there so much to manipulate, but so as to provide information necessary to make a purchasing decision, and that it stimulates competition. So that advertising gives you important, pertinent information about the product that you're thinking about purchasing. So if you really want a safe car, then an advertiser who has a really safe car could very well promote that idea of safety, or promote that idea of image, if that's what you're into. If you want a stylish car, if you want a car that's going to give you stamp you in terms of social approval or social prestige or something like that. Or if you're looking at a daycare, advertisers could give you information about safety or health or the happiness of the children or something like that. So you could argue, look, what advertising does is it allows consumers to digest and to become aware of pertinent information relative to their purchase. And the consumers can't simply research all the different options out there to them. And so it gives them that information. And by so doing, it also stimulates competition in the sense that a rival, a competitor, is going to say, all right, well, this my competition over here is doing this with their restaurant or with their education. Maybe it's a school. And so then if we want to keep up, if we want to attract new consumers, then we've got to improve ourselves. We've got to offer something new. We've got to offer something extra. And in fact, myself and my wife, I just had an experience of this where we're planning a vacation to Hershey Lodge over the break, and the lodge there has this really nice pool. It's a lot of kid stuff, cargo nets, play areas, that kind of stuff. We were talking about the fact that, well, that's probably a result of the fact that other places like Great Wolf Lodge and other family kind of play areas, play lodges, play retreats have done this. And so in order to compete with those other lodges and places where families can go to spend their time, the Hershey Lodge had to kind of go and do this. And so it'll advertise that, the great new pool with all these kind of amenities. And so that promotion of competition, certainly from a free market perspective, as we've talked about a lot, is a good thing. Now, with regard to advertising, the book talks about puffery, and so that can be okay, when an advertiser makes an obviously false claim, but does it in a way that is for comic purposes, done in a way that's obviously comedic, obviously being exaggerating, obviously not to be taken seriously. That can be okay because it's not trying to manipulate you, it's not trying to deceive you. For any rational person, they would look at that advertisement and say, okay, that's not serious, but it's trying to get me to buy their product by being funny, by making a joke, that kind of deal. All right, now, autonomy at work. Again, the focus thus far has largely been on consumer autonomy, but employee autonomy is also very important. And with regard to employee autonomy, work by its nature restricts autonomy in the sense that you are paid to do a certain job, and the employer has a right to ask you to do certain things, and at least when you're on the job, perform in the way that the employer wants. Not for you to simply do whatever you wish, whatever you please. So in exchange for compensation, in exchange for a salary, employers can demand certain things like dress codes, certain hours that you have to work or you have to be at the business, talking points on scripts. If you're talking to a customer, you have to say this. Confidentiality with regard to certain matters. So all these could be ways that you as an employee agree to not simply do what you want, but to follow the directives and the principles and the program of the business of which you're a part. So you voluntarily agree to restrict your autonomy in exchange for a salary. Now, the interesting question would be, how far would you take this? And certainly that's one of our discussions in class is, would there be any restriction that goes too far, that is too much, that should not be asked in exchange for a salary? Kind of a good example that occurred a few years ago now at this point, but I think kind of brings the point to bear. There was once an Eagles employee that was fired because he criticized the Eagles when they let go of Brian Dawkins. So Brian Dawkins was for those of you that aren't football fans, one of the Eagles' best defensive players in history, and they let him go. And the employee essentially said, look, this is terrible, this is awful, and he was fired. And he made this comment on Facebook. So it raises the question, should an employer, have the right to fire an employee based upon what they say about their personal views about the business? When expressed, can they fire him if it's said to someone kind of in passing or a friend over the phone or something like that? Is that different than somebody that would post their opinions online? Should an employer be allowed to fire an employee if they post something online related to a controversial issue, perhaps a political issue? Is that okay for employers to say, no, you cannot express your personal views on these issues outside of work, or you can't express your views on certain social media platforms? So all of those raise the question of, okay, you're getting a salary and you agree that your autonomy is going to be restricted, but to what degree should it be restricted? Now we look at the Catholic position when it comes to employees. The Catholic position is interesting in the sense that they're going to say that work is intimately connected to who we are as human beings. Work shapes us. So work that would undermine our autonomy completely, work that would make us slaves, work that would say we have no rights, that we would say we would have no freedom, that would say that our opinion doesn't matter, that would essentially treat us as worthless or treat us as tools, or treat us in the most extreme extent as slaves. That kind of work is going to shape us into the kind of being that we are not meant to be. It's going to undermine our human dignity. It is going to destroy our ability to be co-creators. And so, a Catholic position would not endorse that kind of work. You should not treat the products of the work as more important, as more valuable than the people that are making it. And there's that great line in the encyclical that said, it's damaging, it's disturbing when the product comes out and it's new and it's shiny and it's glorious, but the workers are treated awfully. The workers are treated like dirt. Now, a big part of a Catholic treatment of employees comes down to this principle of subsidiarity. So the principle of subsidiarity essentially means that the employee should get as much autonomy as possible with regard to the tasks to which they are assigned. To take it from the other perspective, the employer should try to give the employee as much autonomy as possible, as much say as possible, with regard to the task to which they're assigned. Now, that doesn't mean anything goes, and it doesn't mean that there's no restrictions, because, again, contract at work is indistinguishable, cannot be separated, is inseparable from a certain restriction of autonomy. But the Catholic position is, look, you want to make employees feel like they are as much creators, as they're as creative as possible with regard to what they are supposed to do, with regard to their role in the company. So for example, if you got a janitor, what's the best way, do you think, to accomplish your task? What's the best way to clean this floor? If you've got a junior level marketing executive, you talk to them about, okay, how can we best reach consumers? What are your ideas? How would you approach this marketing campaign? If you're talking about teachers, as much as possible, give them the power to run their classroom in the way that they know best, in the way that best matches their skills to these students. And so the principle of subsidiarity means that, look, it's not you do anything you want and that you as the individual employee have the final say or something like that, but it is saying you should have input. You should have as much input as possible when it comes to the task to which you're assigned, because you are, from the Catholic perspective, a co-creator. And so the employer should treat you like that. And so there's a great kind of respect for employees, and autonomy plays an important role with regard to a Catholic approach to employees and employer relations. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is the idea of drug testing. So here's an interesting case study related to autonomy. Should employers be allowed to drug test you? Or does drug testing overly restrict your autonomy? We talked earlier about what would be going too far in terms of the restrictions of autonomy. Is drug testing one of them? Should you be allowed to use drugs outside of work on your free time if that's what you want to do? Or is it legitimate for an employer to test whether or not you are using drugs? Now, when it comes to justifications for drug use, and you can either agree or disagree with this, Gibson gives a number of points here. He says, well, certainly you could argue that drug testing is legitimate and even necessary, and even a moral imperative. It should be done for jobs with potential for catastrophe. For example, airline pilots. You might say, look, they have the lives of hundreds of people in their hands every time they go up in the air. Therefore, they should be tested because drugs could potentially undermine their ability to fly their plane. You might also think of something like a heavy machine operator. That kind of person could, if using the machinery improperly, harm, injure, and even kill others. So you might say that kind of person deserves to be tested, ought to be tested. So the general principle here would be that people that have jobs where they have the power to harm or even kill others should be tested with regard to whether or not they're using substances that could undermine their performance. Another justification would be the loss of productivity. So maybe you say, look, I have the right to test drugs because drugs could undermine productivity, and therefore I want to make sure my employees are as productive as possible, and therefore I'm going to test them. Now you might ask, well, is it right to test them preemptively for drugs on the basis of productivity? Or should you simply monitor productivity? And if an employee is not producing, simply monitor that, test that, follow up with that. And if they don't produce, you get rid of them. But not using productivity as a reason to test for drugs. That's the issue here. That's the question. You might also argue that drug testing is okay from the perspective of legality, that an employer has the right to fire an employee for illegal activity, and that the employer has the right to know if the employee is engaged in illegal activity. Finally, morality. You might argue that, look, an employer has a right to demand a certain moral character of his or her employees. Drug testing speaks to, at least one could argue, the moral fitness of an individual. And therefore an employer has a right to test because an employer has a right to know whether his or her employees are in fact upholding and living by the moral standards. Finally, one final point, you could justify on the grounds of paternalism, that an employer maybe believes that he or she knows what's best for the employee, and that doing drugs is not going to be what's best for the employee, that the employee would be harmed by doing drugs, and therefore the employer has the right to test. Kind of a final point, I'm not going to go into details, but something to think about. What about psychological testing? Is it okay for an employer to test employees on a psychological level? Okay, so that's a wrap for autonomy. It's a very rich concept, a very rich chapter, and so in this video, talked about advertising as either hindering or supporting autonomy, and also talked about a Catholic approach to autonomy, how to give workers as much autonomy as possible. And then finally, drug testing as an example of a case where you may or may not agree that an employer has a right to test for autonomy. All right, that's the video.